Now we know that a heart block is a disruption of the electrical system of the heart, and we also know that an electrocardiogram can be used to diagnose it. Well, an electrocardiogram can also give us information about where in the electric system the problem is. Now, a side note, you'll probably hear me use the term both ECG and EKG to refer to an electrocardiogram. Now, for historical reasons, both of these are correct and they both refer to the same thing. Well, let's remind ourselves of the basics of an electrocardiogram rhythm strip. This tracing represents a single heartbeat on a single lead of the electrocardiogram. Most people refer to a single lead of an electrocardiogram as a rhythm strip. You can see this line has a couple bumps and a sharp point on it. Well, we can divide it into sections. Here at the front, we have a small bump that's called the P wave. The P wave is the signal picked up by the wave of electrical depolarization of the atria at the top of the heart. This prominent spiky bit in the middle is called the QRS complex, and it is made up of separate Q waves, R, and S components. This reflects depolarization and contraction of the ventricular system, mostly the left ventricle. After the QRS complex comes the T wave, and the T wave doesn't reflect a contraction of the heart, but rather it's the repolarization of the left ventricle as it regains its electrical energy. So let's look at a succession of heartbeats on a rhythm strip. Here we can see our P wave, our QRS complex, and our T wave. As the heart beats, this electrical signal repeats itself over time. And this is a normal rhythm. But going back to the heart, what if there's a problem between this first part of the electrical system, called the sinoatrial node, or SA node, and the atrioventricular node, or AV node? So that problem happens somewhere in this region. Now let's say it doesn't completely block your electrical signal, but it does slow it down. What would that look like? Well, here we have another rhythm strip. And again, I'm going to label our P waves and our QRS complexes. But you'll notice something different about these two rhythm strips. The distance between the P wave and the QRS complex is a little bit longer. This distance right here. In fact, it's that way for every single one that we see. Again, compare these two distances. You can see one is definitely longer than the other. Now this space between the P and the QRS is known as the PR interval. And when you have a problem between your SA node and your AV node, but not a complete block, that PR interval becomes too long. This is what we call a first degree block. So what happens if you have a problem with your AV node itself? Again, this isn't a complete block of the node, but what if the AV node is having a hard time keeping up with the signal sent from the sinoatrial node? Well, let's look at another rhythm strip. Again, I'll look for my P waves. I'll mark them off here. And my QRS complexes. And I want to take a look at that PR interval again. So here it looks pretty normal if we compare that to the strip at the top. Let's look at the next one. This one looks a little bit different. It's a little bit longer. Wow, the one after that is longer still. And here's something unusual has happened. We have a P wave, but then we don't have a QRS complex. And then we have another P wave, and then we have a relatively normal looking PR interval. In this situation, it looks like the signal from the P wave gets transmitted to the ventricle as the QRS complex, but it's lagging behind a little bit each time. It's like the AV node just can't quite keep up, and here it just loses step altogether, and it just doesn't transmit a signal. But then it has a chance to rest, it has a chance to get its act together, and the next time a P wave comes down, it goes ahead and transmits that to the ventricle as a QRS complex. This pattern, if we continued the strip, would repeat itself. And this is called a second degree block. But because nothing is simple, people have given this another name. This is also called a Mobitz type 1 block. And because really nothing is simple, this has a third name called Winky-Bach. Now, Winky-Bach is actually a great name for this strip because it actually sounds like what's going on. Here we have PR interval prolongation, a little bit more, and then a dropped QRS complex. What that sounds like to me is winky, 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 bach, as that QRS complex is dropped and the heart misses a beat. So what happens if you have disease a little bit lower down in these fibers of the electrical conducting system, just past the AV node? But, like before, this isn't a complete block. Some of the electrical activity is able to get through. Let's look at another strip. So again, we'll start by labeling our P waves. Looks like there's one there. Looks like we have another one here, here, here. We'll label out QRS complexes, QRS, QRS, QRS. But something funny is happening. It looks like we have 2 P waves for every QRS complex. It looks like some of the signal is getting through to the ventricle and we're picking it up as a QRS complex. Other times the atria are contracting with a P wave, but nothing is happening in the ventricle. In this situation, the upper fibers after the AV node are taking too long to reset themselves so that they can transmit a signal again. So when a signal is transmitted, for instance here where we have a normal looking P and then QRS complex, those fibers are tired and it takes time for them to reset. But by the time the next P wave comes along here, they're not ready yet, and it takes a little bit longer for them to get ready. By the time the next one comes along, they're ready to go and they send a signal on as a QRS complex, and the pattern repeats itself. This is also a second degree block, but we can also call it a Mobitz type 2. So now, what if we take it one step further and we completely cut the electrical system? Say the patient has had a very bad heart attack and there's just nothing getting through. All our previous examples, some things were getting through, but in this case, we've blocked it all. Well, back to the rhythm strips. Again, let's dutifully look for our P waves and mark them off. And we'll find our QRS complexes. But if we look at this closer, there's some funny stuff going on compared to what our rhythm strip ought to look like. In fact, we probably have a little P wave buried right in here. It looks a little funny because it looks like it just got added on top of this T wave, and the two are mixing together. We have the same situation over here. A little bit of P wave is poking through and a little bit of T wave is right here next to it, slightly overlapping. Same thing over here. This T wave and this P wave are overlapping a little bit. In fact, we have some P waves that look like they're buried in our QRS complexes. Here's one right here. There's another one hiding in this one over here. It's a little bit funny. It looks like our P waves are marching along and not paying any attention to what the QRS complexes are doing. The QRS complexes are also marching along pretty regularly, just doing their own thing. And there's a normal T wave after each QRS complex as well. Some of them are getting mixed into the P waves. What this means is that this block is not allowing any signal to get from the atria at the top of the heart to the ventricles. Now this is a pretty bad problem. You might think that the heart would just fail to beat in the ventricles, but thankfully your heart has a backup plan. Somewhere in the conducting system, some of these cells take over the job of transmitting the initial signal. And the signal will start here, and then it will progress like it normally would, causing the ventricle to contract. Now, these backup generators of electrical signals never quite do their thing as quickly as they ought to, and the distance between the QRS complexes is much wider than it ought to be. Patients with this particular problem will have persistently very low heart rates. This 100% block of the electrical signal is known as a third-degree heart block, also called a complete block. So comparing all of our rhythm strips, we have our normal up here with nice P, QRS, and T components. We have a first degree block where there's just an increased distance between the P and the QRS. We have our two types of second degree blocks, a Mobitz 1 or Winky block where we have an AV node that can't keep up with the SA node and it falls further and further behind and eventually drops a beat, or Winky, Winky, Winky Bach. A second degree block, or Mobitz type 2, where it takes too long for the lower electrical pathways to reset themselves, and you have multiple P waves for each QRS complex. And then we have a complete block, or a third degree block, where there's no association between the P waves and the QRS complexes whatsoever.